Mindy has experienced multiple forms of grief: loss of health through cancer, unexplained infertility, loss of friends through death or life's transition, and pet loss. Having specialized in pet loss, Mindy says that as a society we don't have the rituals and the support to support those who lost a pet in the same way as we do when we lose a human being. As a therapist, she focuses on supporting clients after pet loss and shares with us what she has learned from those people dealing with their losses. About this week's guest, Mindy Meiering, LCSW, is a licensed therapist, certified coach, and a mindfulness teacher who specializes in grief and loss. She began her career as a psychotherapist in 1995, and over the last 3 decades, she has supported countless of individuals and families as they face serious illness, end-of-life issues, and other significant losses and life transitions. Despite her extensive experience with grief, she was blindsided by how devastated she felt after losing her first dog, Ellie. Her personal experience helped her understand how heartbreaking the loss of a pet can be and inspired her to become a pet loss and grief specialist and create the Rainbow Bridge Pet Loss Deck. She lives in Colorado with her husband and their 2 scruffy terriers, Izzy and Charlie. Please check out Mindy's Rainbow Bridge Deck card, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Mindy created an audio for us today as a podcast gift. Go to the podcast gift page on Natalie's website, enter the number of today's podcast as a word, and enjoy this meditation. So welcome, Mindy. It's so nice to have you today here on the podcast. How are you today?
It's a joy to be here. I am doing well. I feel, I feel a bit tender this morning. I've been reflecting on my grief journey these last 7 or 8 years. And so I feel really delighted to be here. And my heart also feels tender and open, and just looking forward to this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so for those of you listening, you are aware that this is a podcast on how to deal with grief and trauma. And this is what we're going to talk about today. So anyone listening as well, if you are here, take a moment and take time for yourself and pause anytime you need to. This is not something that needs to be listened to in one go. If something comes up, you can come back. So why don't we start with you telling the listener a little bit about how life has presented you with experiences of loss, of grief, and of trauma?
Sure. So, my life, grief really was in my life in a more professional sense. I was trained as a licensed clinical social worker and a therapist. And one of the very first classes that I ever took, my professor used the grief model to help. And it was illuminating for me. I was only 21 years old. This was 30 years ago. But she talked about the grief model and how that can help us understand any type of loss, not just the death of someone that we love, but relationships changing and ending, divorce, losing a job, the loss of a dream. And that really helped me as I stepped into my work. And I worked in hospitals for about 16 years, and both supporting people who were dealing with emotional and issues. And I worked in psychiatry for a number of years and then moved into a more medical role the last 10 years that I worked in hospitals. And so I was around a lot of illness and death and dying, but it wasn't until about 8 years ago that I had a much more intimate personal experience with grief myself. And it was my husband and I got married a little bit later, and we struggled to get pregnant. We wanted to have children, and so we did infertility treatments, and to make a very long story short, after 7, 8 years, we it didn't work for us, and we don't know why. They call it unexplained infertility, and I'm sure part of it was our age. We were a bit older, but that was a very significant loss. And in the midst of that, in this was November of 2015, one of my best friends died from cancer. And in that same month, I was diagnosed with cancer myself, B-cell lymphoma. And and so that began a healing journey of a number of years. And so there was the loss, really the loss of my health. And I want to weave together this timeline in a way that it makes sense to people. It was that next year, we were still going through IVF, that one of my oncologists had said, with the hormones that you're putting into your body, this probably isn't good for your health, these exogenous hormones. So we decided to stop the IVF, and the cancer was progressing, and slowly, but progressing. And so I think that was in 2017. And then around that time, also in May of 2017, we lost one of our 15-year-old dogs. So there were all these big things happening. And our dog Trek he was 15, and he had been off and on, had some health issues, but we had just been at the veterinarian the day before with three of our three dogs. And she said, they all look great. And the next morning we woke up at 5:30, and I heard this really horrible noise and coming from the other room where he slept. And I woke up and kind of stumbled out there to see what was happening. And there was just a trail of blood, just blood all throughout our house. And he was wheezing. And what we think happened is that he had some kind of a tumor in his nasal cavity that had ruptured. And so he could barely breathe. It was really horrible. And we waited until the vet opened and took him in. And she just looked at us and said, I don't think there's anything more that I can do for him. And so while we knew he wasn't well, he was struggling with something, it was unexpected. Like it was a bit abrupt.
Completely. If you say the day before you went to the vet and she said, they look fine.
Yeah, they look fine. He looks great. And he had nosebleeds off and on for a while. We were doing lots of different holistic treatments to support him. We just wanted it was more palliative care, like just treating symptoms, because we thought, even if it's cancer, he's 15. We don't want to put him through any type of stressful treatment. But when that happened, it was very traumatic to wake up, to see that blood, to go through that. And I had never lost a pet before. My first dog that I ever adopted, Ellie, was still with us. She was still alive, and she was 13 at the time. And so I had adopted her. And this was before my husband and I got married, and Trek had been Patrick's dog. And then, of course, like, he became, my dog too. And I just had never experienced that. And it was probably one of the most painful losses that I had experienced. And that, along with just moving through the infertility, and also there was just we were in this time of transition. My husband and I were working on a project. We live in Colorado, but we had for many years had this dream of building a small retreat center, and a number of circumstances came together that we became the stewards of this piece of land on the Big Island, and we were working on this project and trying to get all the pieces in place to begin building it. And so also we had just sort of in those last 2 years been starting, putting down roots in this new community. And so I think for anyone that's, when you move and you're in a new place, there was a loss of also like relationships that had changed because we weren't spending as much time in Colorado anymore. And a lot of relationships were changing. And so it was a very subtle level, but there was that loss happening also, right? It was a more ambiguous loss. And certainly we were creating new friendships and new community there, but it was a time of much transition. And so, so when Trek died, that was incredibly difficult. And then following that, not too long after that, my cancer had progressed to the point where it was stage 3, and we had just been watching it. It's a very slow growing kind of cancer that I was diagnosed with. I began 2 years of treatment. And so I feel very fortunate. I felt very supported, and but there's always that uncertainty, that feeling of, for me, it was a feeling of that I had to work with, that, my body had betrayed me in some way. Like my health, I'd always taken really good care of myself, and I had cancer. I had done everything I could, and I couldn't get pregnant. I really had to work with that feeling of loss and working with that sense that, like I said, my body had betrayed me in some way. There was, there was a lot happening during that time. And then in January of 2019, we were flying back to the Big Island with our other 2 dogs for a 6-month stretch. And on the first flight from Durango to Denver, Ellie, I had mentioned I had adopted her as a puppy, and had her for 15 years in my life. And she'd been with me through so many changes and transitions. She was an amazing dog. And she crashed on that first flight. And similar to our other dog, her health, as she got older, had been declining, but she was okay before we left. And on that first flight, and she had traveled quite a bit with me, she crashed, and she was anxious, and it was really horrible. It was probably the longest 45-minute flight of my life. And so we got to Denver, and we went and found just the quietest corner we could. And I just looked in this little being's eyes, and it was just so clear. Like, I'm not, it was really clear that she wasn't just having a bad day, that this was, we had come to the end here. I felt like so many beautiful things happened that day that made really one of the most painful days of my life a little bit easier. There was just so much grace. We had some good friends in Denver that were available and came to pick me up with Ellie. My husband had to keep flying on because we had another dog that was traveling, and he's larger, so he had to travel in cargo. And so Patrick had to fly on to meet our other dog so that it didn't have to go, so that our other dog wouldn't have to go into quarantine. And so I stayed in Denver with Ellie. I actually had been working on a book about pet loss that I started writing after we lost Trek. And I had interviewed one of the founders of this pet hospice. It's a national pet hospice. And so immediately I kind of went into social work mode, like, okay, I need to find, problem solving. What do I do now? And I just thought, okay, I'm going to call this pet hospice. They have a chapter in Denver. I'm going to see when they can send a veterinarian out. And so that evening, a veterinarian came out to my friend's home And she was an angel. She was the most wonderful, compassionate human. And she spent quite a bit of time with me and with Ellie. And it was a very peaceful transition for Ellie. And that loss, moving through that, it was very painful. And I think at that point, I realized how like there was this cumulative grief.
Yeah.
And it was, I call it like the layers of this is just a very not clinical term, but I call it the layers of loss, but really it's cumulative grief. And so, in 2019, it was really this year of deep healing for me, and really doing some deep inner work around those losses that had occurred. And I think, along with losing both of the two dogs, it also, there was just that coming to terms with the fact that I was not going to be able to have my own children. And I hadn't fully grieved that loss. And it really came rising to the surface. So that was really a year of deep healing for me as I continue to go through my treatment. And I was really grateful to have the tools that I did available to me. I am a mindfulness teacher and was also trained as a mindful self-compassion teacher, and being able to slow down and really be present with what I was feeling was so crucial. And to meet myself with the compassion and soften, because I think that, there was this tendency to think I did something, or what did I do wrong that my body couldn't, right? That I couldn't get pregnant, and so I really tried to not engage with that line of thinking when I would notice it coming up, and to meet myself with a lot of compassion and tenderness as I moved through the grief, and then doing my own work in therapy with, I think sometimes we think that like just being trained as a therapist and knowing about grief, I realized I need to do my work with someone. Like, need that person. I need to do my own healing work and have someone that can be holding space for me.
That's one of the questions that I get often is, well, did it help you to know about grief when those significant losses happened? And I have to say, well, similarly to the dentist who knows what the other dentists then need to do, they are still going to need the drilling. They're still going to feel the pain. They're still going to have the healing. So there's not a shortcut when you know about grief.
No. And there is no shortcut.
As much as some people would like there to be a shortcut or a way out or a specific answer to the question of when will this pain stop or how will it get better, it's a very individual process that everyone needs to walk and hopefully have support in that.
Yeah. So it's so true. And after I lost Ellie, again, there were these cumulative losses, but I realized how in our culture, losing a pet, people often talk about how devastating it is. I would say that's the most common term I hear, or heartbreaking. Yet as a society, I don't think we do a very good job of acknowledging and validating pet loss. And so often I will hear in my work, as my work has evolved, I've done more pet loss and grief work over the last few years. And I will hear people say again and again that losing a pet has felt more painful and a more difficult loss than when they've lost a human loved one. And yet there's a way in which they sometimes will whisper that or not, feel like bad about that. But the truth is that, and there's so much research now validating this, that the human animal bond is so strong, and that these precious animal beings who are not, people will say they're just like family, and I say, how about taking out the just? They are parts of our family. They are members of our family, and it is very painful when we lose them. And we don't have, in our society, we really don't have the rituals and supports in place to support people who have lost a pet in the same way that we do when we've lost a human loved one.
And we've
Mhm.
spoken about this before recording, and I think one of the key elements that even in my loss of my cat sort of was lingering in the background, which is this statement starting, well, it's just an animal, a cat or a dog or whatever.
Right.
And in that lies, in my view, and I'd love to hear your view, I think in there lies the belief that a human life matters more than an animal. And I think it's not beneficial to make this comparison because it's not beneficial to the person grieving.
Right. I agree 100% with that. And yeah, it's like comparing losses, and it's not helpful, because for that person, for anyone who has, I think anyone who has lost an animal that they've loved, they will say it's as painful as, as losing a human loved one that they've lost. And comparing it, you're right, doesn't help. I think in general, comparing our losses
Yeah. Well, the
is
thing is,
not
even if we say then the loss of an animal equals or is as painful, even then we're comparing. And
yeah.
I say, in my view, it is the only place where I can compare my feelings of loss is
Mhm.
with my own losses. So I have lost my younger daughter, it was yesterday, 12 years ago, and then my mother to suicide, and then the two cats. These are the sort of significant losses. So I can compare my reaction to those and my healing, my grieving with those within myself. But that does not give me the right, or doesn't actually help if I then compare your losses, your mother loss versus your animal loss. Because what I
Yeah.
think is most important is that the loss is determined by the relationship, by the meaning that we have with that being, with that, maybe even is a thing, right? But
Yeah.
with that being, with that entity, and the relationship determines the loss. So
Yeah.
in that framework, it's important to see that whatever the relationship is, so is the loss, so is the feeling of that is missing. Now you are working with clients as well, specifically with pet loss, and
Yeah.
tell us a little bit as well for the people listening to this, both pet owners and not. What have you learned from those people who are also dealing with pet loss?
So much. I'm always so deeply touched, first of all, when someone comes to see me, because it means that they're reaching out for support. And I think that we often don't do that enough. And I'm speaking in generalities, but we often think that we should be able to get through it, and kind of that pull ourselves up by our bootstraps mentality, and we should be able to get through this on our own. And so I'm always really touched when someone does reach out and say, I'm really struggling and I would like to come and talk to you. But what I have, I think one of the things I've learned is how beautiful the connection is. And I know this from my own experience, but hearing stories of people, I had one woman who came to do some work with me, and she had lost, she actually had a pet that she had to rehome. She could not give this dog what it needed. It had a lot of behavioral issues, and she only had her for about 8 months, but she said, we had the most beautiful connection. And she was grieving so deeply that she couldn't keep this dog and really give this animal what it needed. And I think I'm touched by just the depth of connection. And like you were talking about, it's our loss is so often like a reflection of the relationship that we had. And I'm really touched by the depth of the bond that people have with their animals, just how deeply we love these four-legged beings that we have in our lives. And so it's an honor to be able to support people in that way as they're grieving. And sometimes it's an animal who's died. Other times, like with this woman, she had to rehome her pet. And being able to validate that grief. One thing I've learned is that pet loss is often a form of grief that isn't as acknowledged or validated as other forms of grief. And I really try and do that in my work with people to validate and also acknowledge that, like any type of grief, that this is a process and it's not a linear process. In fact, I was just talking to a friend the other day, and we weren't working together, but she said, I had this experience recently, and she said, I had a very special dog in my life, and I lost him 15 years ago. And she said, I feel like just something happened recently, and I feel like I have reached a point of where I have fully grieved his loss. And she said, I know that there will still be moments of sadness that come up, but it's taken me that long. I think we often want to rush through our grief, or we want the pain, or that we want to be over. Oh, we want it to be over. People will often say, when is this going to be over? And I thought it was beautiful. This woman that I was talking to said, I've just really let myself be with the waves of grief as they've come up over the years.
Yeah. So besides what you mentioned before was acknowledging the loss that you do mainly in your work with the clients, what would you want other pet owners who have lost, or who are maybe even knowing that at some point in their life, most likely before their own death, they're going to lose their pet? What would you want them to know?
I would want them to know that their grief is a reflection of how deeply they love their pet, the bond that they had with them. I would want them to know that it can be so helpful to reach out for support, to talk to other people who are grieving a similar loss, that they don't have to move through their grief alone or feel badly that it's taking a long, I'm looking for the right words here, that it will take as long as it takes. That sounds so cliche, but it's so true. That grief is not a linear process. And I would want to just hand them a permission slip that says, please take the time that you need to grieve this loss.
And also one thing that stuck out from before when we spoke is that grief, maybe it is in relation to a pet or to someone or something else, is often an invitation for any unmet feelings of grief in relation to other losses to then be felt. Like grief, I say grief vibrates at a certain frequency. And if a loss hasn't been fully met or hasn't been fully grieved for, any other subsequent loss can be an invitation to go backwards and say, how about this? And it might not be so obvious.
Yes. And that was the case for me. In fact, it was about a year after we had lost track and before Ellie died. And I had this it was full. I was traveling. I was going through a mindfulness teacher training program. I was working there were so many different moving parts to life. And then the holidays came around and I had this spaciousness, and I had been looking forward to this time. I had almost 3 weeks that I had taken off. And Natalie, I didn't know what was happening at first, because I was waking up and I just I felt so sad all of the time. And of course there had been a little bit of time since these losses, but I was finding myself, getting tearful and feeling down. And about a month into this, and I do a lot of writing, I do a lot of journaling, a lot of writing. And so I was doing a lot of writing, and I realized that I finally had the space to begin meeting this grief. The infertility, the loss of track, there was still the loss of my friend, and that was coming in waves. One of those moments where I just couldn't see it. And I have a really good friend she's in her 70s. She's a retired therapist. And I called her one day and I said, I think that I'm starting to, or I said, I think I still need to really grieve these losses. And she said, I was wondering when this was going to happen. I was wondering. And I didn't see it. And I think that's where having outside support can be so helpful. Trusted friends that we can talk to. And I think that's the other, going back to your question about what would I say to grieving people who are grieving the loss of a pet, be mindful of who you invite in for support, because there are people who may not have pets, or maybe they're not animal lovers, who do think of your animal as just a cat or just a dog. And why can't you move on? Or why don't you just get another pet? Maybe that would help. And I think those kinds of comments can be very unhelpful and hurtful. So being mindful about who we seek out for support.
I think that's a really important point that you're making. Thank you. Because, in specifically those moments where we're needing support, we want to be really mindful of not just when, but how and who we ask. Because, all of these comments that you made, which is replacement of the loss, or keep yourself busy, or gotta be strong for others, these are so commonly held beliefs in society. And when people are lost for words or helpless in what to do for you, that in the case of grieving, they retract back to those things that they know best. And these are the things that are portrayed all in the media. So for those people who want to reach out to you, we're going to put all the links to Mindy's offerings and that she has with pet loss support into the show notes, so you can go and find them there. And also you have some cards that you made. You want to say something shortly about the cards?
I do. Well, so I was talking about the book that I started writing, and I set that down when I was going through that time, a couple of years of doing my own deep healing work. I set that aside. And then when I picked it back up after, it was about a year after Ellie died, I realized that when we're grieving, it has such an impact, physically on us, and it can be very difficult to concentrate, to focus. And so I wanted to create a resource that would be more accessible for people who are grieving the loss of a pet. And so I created this card deck, and it's a deck of 52 cards, and it has different ways that people can support themselves as they're grieving the loss of a pet, coping strategies and tools to work with their grief, and then also different ways that you can honor your pet's memory. And so it's been lovely to hear about the different ways that people use the deck. Some people pull a card each day as a part of a grief ritual while they're grieving, and some people just pull a card maybe once a week or whenever they feel inspired to. I went back to that time after I had lost both Trek and Ellie, and I thought about how I had books, but I would sit down to read and it was really hard. It was just hard to concentrate. And so later I could read, but in that first month or two, something like this would have been really helpful, where I could just pull a card and it could be a touchstone for me, something to think about.
So they are also going to be in the show notes for you to have a look at. Mindy has them on her website as an image, so you can have a look at them.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Mindy, for sharing your experience, your personal experience, but also your work with clients that you support. Would it be okay to finish with the rapid fire questions?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yes. Let's do it.
So these are just sentence starters, and we're going to finish them with a short answer. And maybe we'll look at them in relation to pet loss. That might be interesting.
Yeah.
So what does grieving and trauma in relation to pet loss mean?
I know I said this earlier, but I think that it is about bringing love and acceptance to our process, remembering the love that we shared with our animals, remembering that our grief is a reflection of that love. And the other word that comes to mind is, in whatever way we lost our animal, bringing forgiveness. That's the word that comes up, forgiveness. Yeah. Remembering that we did the best we could for them in whatever ways their lives ended.
And healing means?
Gosh, the similar answer is coming up. I think healing means bringing love and acceptance to all of ourselves.
And what have you learned about yourself in the light of loss and trauma?
I have learned how strong and resilient I am. And I have also learned how to meet myself in a more tender and vulnerable way, and to allow support in more. In the beginning, when I was diagnosed with cancer and going through the infertility, was very quiet about my journey. And as time went on, I realized how healing it was for me to open up more and to allow support in.
And what would be one specific thing that has changed since your losses that you wouldn't want to miss?
I'm just much more awake to the preciousness of life. And, one thing we didn't talk about in the interview, but that is such an integral part of my life, is gratitude. I have a really strong gratitude practice. And I just feel much more awake to the preciousness of life in each day. Even when things feel challenging, it feels like a gift to be here for it all.
Well, thank you so much for today and for shedding a light on specifically pet loss today. Thank you, Mindy.
Thank you so much for creating this space and for having me here. Yeah, it's been a joy.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.